My name is Alice Knapp, and I'm president of the Ferguson Library. And if you've seen this introduction before, you now know it's time for you to silence your phone. Please feel free to take photos during this. It's going to be another memorable evening. Ambassador Harriet Elam-Thomas. During her 4-decade foreign service career, Ambassador Harriet Elam-Thomas demonstrated a lifelong practice of bridging cultures with a unique vision and insight. She placed a human face on diplomacy. Her varied overseas assignments have taken her to Greece, Turkey, France, Belgium, Senegal, Mali, and the Ivory Coast. Domestic assignments include counselor and acting deputy director of the U.S. Information Agency, Foreign Service personnel in Washington, the United Nations in New York, and the White House. Ambassador Elam-Thomas fulfilled her commitment to serve the national interest through public diplomacy during her overseas tours and returned to Africa to serve as the U.S. ambassador to Senegal from January 2000 to December 2002. Her performance abroad has brought recognition from heads of state as well as awards from the U.S. Department of State. Additionally, Ambassador Elam-Thomas has been the recipient of 4 honorary doctorates from Simmons College in Boston, the American University in London, Suffolk University in Boston, and the University of Central Florida in Orlando. She holds a BS in International Business from Simmons and an MS in Public Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She was a member of the Senior Advisory Group of the European Command and served 3 years on the board of the Orlando Philharmonic Orchestra. She is also a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy and serves on the boards of the Institute for International Education, the Cultural Academy for Excellence, and the Board of Co-operators at Simmons College. She was the 2000 recipient of the Director General's Cup for the Foreign Service. She speaks French, Greek, and Turkish. And formerly the diplomat in residence at the University of Central Florida, Ambassador Elam-Thomas now directs a diplomacy program at the university. Please join me in welcoming the ambassador.
I'm going to take this, if I may, I can pull it out this way. Pardon? Oh, here, this way? Yeah. It's green?
You're on, yeah.
Oh, it is. It has to fire up a bit. First of all, I have to tell you that something happened today, about 3 minutes ago, that has never happened in my 3/4 of a century on the planet. Someone comes in and says, "My name is Archie Elam." I said, wait a minute, we have to be related. I have never met someone with my last name in person. Now, I've seen the same 2 people you've talked about in films, cowboys and sports, neither of which look like either of us. So no, wait a minute, I'm speaking a little too quickly. The president of Mahari, Lloyd Elam. We found out we were cousins. Now, that goes way, way back. But I must say to all of you, today is another special treat because someone I grew up with is in the audience. And I don't think we've seen each other in over 50 years. So I walk in and I say, that face looks familiar. And then 3 weeks ago, I was having lunch with a woman named Ellen Hurwitz, who was the former president of the American University in Kyrgyzstan. She said, "You're going to the Ferguson Library? That's my town. I spent all of my young days there." And I'm saying, what a small world. So then she gets on the phone to try to tell friends of hers who are traveling to be sure to come. But before I even arrived, my colleagues at the university, those in journalism, said that you are very fortunate to be able to come up to this library. It is really, truly known for the Civility series. So at the outset, I dare not try to talk about defining civility to all of you, because you've probably heard this so much, you know it inside out. I thought I would engage this discussion with all of you on the role of civility and its impact, or lack thereof, in international affairs, and how The course that I teach on diplomacy at the University of Central Florida is one that begins and in the middle and ends with the need to be civil. Every American embassy overseas is established with the permission of the host government. My Foreign Service colleague here, we know that. But some people forget that, even diplomats. So when I was in Denmark at the time that USIA was going to be consolidated to the State Department, I'm in a room with a group of USIA officers talking about those people, and they're talking about the Danes. I said, well, now I know it's not a color thing. There is that tiny bit of arrogance that America has around the world, sadly, to this day. For many years, it was the 800-pound gorilla. And because of that, we didn't feel we had to know too much about anybody else. Well, I tell my students, don't walk into a reception thinking you know it all, because your guests have done their homework. They will know more about our history and the worst things that we do, because that's going to be on the news each and every day. Every bit of news that we would not want to share with the world will be the lead item overseas. So what is your role? To try to correct the misperceptions that people have about America. At our annual 4th of July event, there was always one for the host country guests and then one for the Americans. And each time I commended my American colleagues for doing things that a lot of people don't know about. Adopting children from around the world of every race, color, and creed. Raising their own children and then adopting someone from Sierra Leone, from Nigeria, Eastern Europe, you name it. And not even giving it a second thought. A Senegalese young man was hit by a motorcycle, and one of our couriers, or I should say one of our communicators at that time, white American, jumps on there to save this young man's life. So I'm at the embassy's medical unit, and he's saying to me, Ambassador, but I don't know if he's going to live, and I don't know if I did enough. And I said, you cared. He will survive. He did survive, thank goodness. Our colleague, the young man I went to see, was burned significantly. But you're not going to hear this story on the news. It's too positive. What was he doing? He was being a caring human being. Being civil. We all saw on May 27th, a young man from Mali scale the walls of a Paris apartment building to save the life of a child. He was not concerned what would happen. He had no idea what would happen. He was concerned about saving another human being. He was being civil. And fortunately, the French President Emmanuel Macron has now, as you've read, made certain that his path to citizenship will be facilitated, and evidently the pompiers, the fire department, wants very much to hire him. Is that a magnificent story about being civil and caring? But again, we know this because I watch BBC a lot, but it did actually make it to CNN and MSNBC and Fox and what have you in the United States. But when my students are studying with me, their challenge is to bring me the news items of 4 international media outlets. I don't want to hear what's in the United States. I want to hear how other television stations and newspapers, and I said, even France has an edition of Le Monde in English. Is it still just on weekends? You haven't been there for 4 months. So you're out of touch. But I wanted them to know that the world treats news in a very different way than we do. And they look at the whole person. They're not caring what Kim Kardashian did this week and so the other. It is uplifting to see what transpires beyond the confines of the United States. And why? Because you remember you are not the only person on the planet. There's a chapter in my book that says America is not the only place on the planet. But we think we are. And that's where we get into trouble around the world. But I must say that through my career, 35 years out of the United States, and much of it with the U.S. Information Agency, where I dealt with culture and the arts and exchange programs, we were able to reach individuals with different political views in a way that my colleagues in the political section could not reach that audience, because the host country's individuals, members of parliament, knew that when a political officer came and had lunch, they were going to go back and write a telegram about where this country is going, who's the next president, and what the opposition leaders are doing. It wasn't the same kind of open, relaxed, engaging conversation about literature, about the arts, and indeed about theater. But I also have to tell you that as an American, I perhaps was trying to be a little too democratic, and I made a few faux pas early on in my career. When you're 32, you think you know a lot, and you're in a culture where age and elders are respected, and status is important. But I wasn't concerned about that. I'm a democratic thinker, small d. So I'm the cultural attaché in Côte d'Ivoire in Abidjan, and I invite the driver to meet with all of us who were working in the embassy on a program preparing for an American lecture to talk about economics in the United States. Why did I do that? The French and the Ivoirian, and there was a Togolese man, said, I don't sit in a room with the driver. Well, I thought that since the driver was bilingual, he was going to the airport to pick up the speaker, the most important thing would be for me to have him in the room with the rest of the people. They let me know that that was not the thing to do. I was trying to be a little too civil. And what I learned is that you cannot superimpose your values on another culture. It was very hard for me to grasp that, because we all, and then I was, as I said, I was a young diplomat and I wanted to be terribly successful. Well, that wasn't the only thing I did. Trust me, some of the others I'm not going to share with you right now. But it was because I didn't understand how to read a different culture. I took a group of Turkish journalists on a NATO tour. This is in the late 90s. And I didn't understand why these 6 men remained so quiet throughout our briefings, or after they were asked to pose questions, until they looked at the most senior in age in the group to get his permission to ask a question. Isn't that refreshing? I was overwhelmed by that kind of discipline, but I was impressed by it because it was something that I really hadn't thought about. Again, young whippersnapper, I'm now 42, and I'm in Greece, and I'm with the ambassador who's taken by Melina Mercouri, and he's forgotten why we came to the meeting, to find out whether the Greeks, that is in the book, whether the Greeks are going to really participate in the 1988 Los Angeles Olympics. But Ambassador Stearns was just the blue eyes, and Melina, who needed a cigarette lit, and he jumps up to give her. I said, but Mr. Ambassador, we haven't found out whether the Greeks are going to do, what participation they will have in the Los Angeles Olympics. Now, again, the ambassador was 25 years older than I, but somewhere I had to get the nerve. It didn't take much, because I was smart aleck at that point. But I realized that, again, I kind of overstepped my bounds, because the Greeks were not happy. There was one other Greek besides Melina in the room. And I had to learn that it's important to really study, the other culture before you want to act. It was initially difficult, but as someone who had been told by her parents, never forget from whence you came, many people wonder why I, very much like Colin Powell, make it my business to know everyone who worked in every embassy, to keep the office clean, who did all of the work when we were gone, and made certain that all of the machines, the pressman, remember in the days when you had the wireless file we used to have, was not electronic. It was on that purple ink thing that it could get all over your hands. That's right, that's it. And I knew that I wasn't going to do it very well, so I learned to be very respectful of every mechanic in the embassy, every person who knew how to run those machines, and to make sure that I knew their name. Because in learning someone's name, you give them a sense of respect. And when you learn their language, you honor them and respect their culture. And you watch the skepticism about America diminish when you interact with them, even if it is for a moment or two. Now, how many people who look like me you know who speak Greek and Turkish? So I am a little odd, and in Harvard Square, when I was speaking Turkish to some students in the Harvard Coop, these kids followed me down the metro in Cambridge. Where did you learn that language? I said, I lived in your country, but I had to learn it before I arrived. And what does this have to do with civility? Well, you will not be invited to the homes of other people in and of the culture if there has to be a third person sitting there as your interpreter. It breaks the line of communication. You have a tendency to look at the person who's doing the interpretation for you, and it certainly puts a distance in terms of the human interaction. So for that reason, I must have spent a lot of time, as I used to say, eating for my government in Greece and in Turkey. It was wonderful because the food was absolutely spectacular. But I also was able to deliver messages that might not have been easy to deliver if I hadn't built up a rapport with the individuals in the field of the arts, in business, in journalism, and in academia. In 1992, there was an article in a Turkish newspaper that stated that the United States government was feeding the PKK terrorists. It was incorrect. I get a call from the American ambassador in Ankara. I'm in Istanbul as the head of the American Press and Cultural Center. I want you to go to the editorial board and tell them this is not true. Well, my Turkish was pretty good, but I knew I had to have a little backup on this one. So I took the senior pressman with me, who was Turkish. But before we went, we had the courtesy, I said, we need to let them know precisely why we're coming, so that they're not going to feel they were hit sight unseen on this controversial issue. And thank goodness, as a result of the Turks who had really drilled me on idiomatic expressions, I got through the entire meeting in Turkish. And the next day, this newspaper printed an apology to the United States government on the front page. I got promoted that year. I hadn't for 8 years before that, and I spent 4 years living in Greece, but that's another story. What I'm going to say to you is that the man who went with us, the senior pressman from Istanbul, said, I have worked in the American embassy for 30 years, and I've never seen an apology in a Turkish newspaper. But what I did was really talk with the 3 editors, all of whom were significantly conservative. It was probably one of the top fundamentalist newspapers in Turkey, so I was really being a little daring. I'll never forget, I've left my eyeglasses there because I went to the ladies' room, but there really wasn't a ladies' room. It was, unisex. And I just didn't think I needed to go back there to get these sunglasses, because somebody had to stand outside of the ladies' room, because it was an all-male staff. I didn't see a woman journalist in the place. So I'm thinking of, this is not quite how I expected to handle myself, or to find where I expected to find myself as a diplomat. But I survived that and went on to share with my students what made the difference. Not only did I speak the language, because there's one thing to speak the language, but you better know a little of the nuances in the culture, the family structure, who really handles the money. Now, I know the Greeks are very macho, but let me tell you, the women handle the money in every Greek family that I visited while I was there. And if any of you saw my big fat Greek wedding, there was a line in there where the mother says to the daughter who's about to get married, make him think it's his idea. And I thought, oh, I remember my mother doing that. That's universal, it's not just Greek. Sorry, gentlemen. But I also learned that the Greeks, Turks, the Belgians, the Senegalese, the Ivoirians, the Malians, they made it their life's work to study about America. And they knew my history so well that I had to be very careful not to throw out what some may have considered a sugar-coated picture of America. It was interesting to spend almost 40 years, 35 years overseas, being the face of the United States and trying to bring some misperceptions to minimize the misperceptions, because the main way we often did it was through the arts. And who were the artists? What is the most famous and the only true indigenous art form in the United States? Jazz. Who did we send during the Cold War when we couldn't communicate civilly or without civility to the Soviets? Performing arts. Louis Armstrong, Dave Brubeck, Dizzy Gillespie, and Benny Goodman. During the time they were traveling abroad in the Cold War, something happened in the United States, in Little Rock, Arkansas, and in Birmingham, Alabama. Well, these individuals realized that they were so conflicted. Have any of you seen the PBS program? There is a PBS program talking about the early days of USIA and the sending of American artists abroad. And they were so conflicted that they did end that tour and came back, because the world saw how people of color were being treated in the schools in the South. And here you're trying to build America's image using the performing arts and being halfway civil. It did not really work in terms of the sense of self for all of these artists. So they came back to the United States. But what they had already done was to change the perception of what America is all about just by being able to communicate through their music. You may remember in 2008, we sent the New York Philharmonic to North Korea. At the end of the performance, the Philharmonic Orchestra played a song that was very close to the heart of the North Koreans. Not only was there a standing ovation, but there were tears in the eyes. Now, I wasn't there. I'm reading a New York Times review. But if that isn't a lesson of civility and of being concerned about your hosts and breaking down a barrier so that you can begin to have those political discussions and negotiations, we need to send the New York Philharmonic back to North Korea once again. But I also would say that we can't heal the rest of the world if we don't begin healing ourselves. Our country is really bleeding. It's torn. People don't want to have reasoned conversations during Thanksgiving or holidays because families are on two different political sides. But there's still a way and I'm going to try to do this for the next 4 or 5 months, to bring these families together and therefore perhaps break down some of the division in this country. And that is, have you ever known two men who are so angry with one another on the political side, not willing to go to a soccer match, watch the World Cup, go to a baseball game? How about women who don't agree with certain things? They'll go to a performance, a performing artists event. When you are seated with someone and you're discussing a painting or the music, you're going to, and you have a glass of wine in your hand, it's more likely that you're going to put those differences aside, at least temporarily. And when you do that, if you're trained as we are, then you're going to sort of subtly get in a political message, but they may not know it. What you will do is talk about the things that have happened in your country. Now, I'm an American, have been all my life. Have you ever known the Greeks to love the Turks? And even though there've been intermarriages, my Turkish teacher was married to a Greek man, and I thought that was wonderful. But that was a little odd. But I can say that when I was in Greece, I heard such animosity about Turks that I would have to say to a gentleman who I was dating at that time, do you know, if we in America kept that animosity in terms of blacks and whites the way you do with Turks, I wouldn't be here working at the American Embassy today. Now, this is 1983 to 87, I'm in Greece, at the height of anti-Americanism in Athens. And he would look at me and I said, you really can't live this way. The Ottoman Empire ended a long time ago. They thought it was last week. Because the parents would reinforce those divisions. And we don't want that to happen in the United States. At least I hope not. I had a number of Greek friends come to dinner at my home in Belgium, and they said, tell me, which did you like, Greece or Turkey, the best? And I said, I'm a diplomat. And a very dear Greek artist friend had brought them. She said, I didn't know how you were going to handle this, Harriet. They would not stop asking that question. So finally I said, I spent 4 years in Athens, Greece, and 4 years in Istanbul, Turkey. Never once did I hear a Turkish citizen say something negative to me about Greece. I didn't. So the Greek couple said to me, well, they won the war. Historically, that yes, it was correct, but why hold on to that animosity? Children have to be taught to hate. Children of different ethnicities, they play in the playgrounds, they don't have a clue and could care less. I see that now in my classrooms. I see a tolerance that did not exist in my generation. My students don't care who is married to whom, what gender, what race, or what religion. They're 18, 19, and 20 years old, and it is refreshing. It truly is. I want to say to those of you who have grandchildren who are millennials, they're not all self-centered, and they're not all so concerned about instant gratification. They're concerned about human trafficking. I spend so much time in my classes with students who are doing work outside of their classes to minimize the human trafficking that even exists on university campuses. They have a genuine desire to be civil with one another. And they will sit down and have discussions, and I've seen them in classrooms. I'm going to give you an example. I knew that the young Democrat vice president, during the time Obama was running, thought the sun rose and set. So we had a debate. I said, I want you to take the position why he should not receive the Nobel Prize. And then I took one of the other students who could have cared less. It was either a McCain supporter, whatever. Didn't matter. I said, I want you to tell me why he should. These students thought that was the worst thing. course assignment I could ever give them, but it proved to me that if they have to do it intellectually, they could. And what they researched, the young lady who thought there were no flaws whatsoever in Barack Obama, the young man who was so strong in support of John McCain, thought that he built an argument that justified the Nobel Prize winning. But you cannot assume that these young men and women are so full of themselves that they don't care about the future. They care about the environment. They care about being civil to one another. And that is the antithesis of everything we've seen in terms of what happens on the internet, and everybody can be terribly mean-spirited because they have the anonymity. And it's because many of us want to hide behind this real world that is so conflicted that we really would rather say what really is in our hearts, because no one has to know what you said. But you've got to live with yourself. The one other comment I'm going to say, and then I'm going to open to questions and answers, is that in Greece, in the height of anti-Americanism, we had the dance theater of Harlem come perform the contemporary, it's really modern dance, it's not ballet per se. The ambassador said that I would like to see if we can negotiate their performance at the famous Greek Herod Atticus Theater to be telecast throughout Greece the entire summer in order to raise the perception of America within the Greek citizenry. Because up to that time, there were demonstrations in front of the American embassy every single day, anti-American demonstrations. At one time led by Papandreou's wife, who was from Elmhurst, Illinois. And I often wondered, I said, wait a minute, these people want, the next day there's long lines around the embassy for people wanting a visa to go to the United States. Does that make any sense? It didn't to me. But there was a little glitch in this desire for us to have an American performing artist group help build America's image. They, the Dance Theater of Harlem, wanted $40,000 for television rights. The Greeks, if they were going to pay it, they would pay it in Greek drachma. Now, last time, how often have you used Greek drachma in the United States? So the impresario, and yours truly, and the press person, and the director then, Arthur Mitchell of Dance Theater of Harlem, spent 2 hours negotiating with the Greeks, down to something like $11,000 in US currency, and they approved it. Otherwise, they were not going to perform at the Herod Atticus Theater. I mean, we've flown them from the United States, an entire dance company, to be part of the Athens Music and Art Festival each year. And they were going to leave and not perform at all, because they were determined to have that kind of financial backing. But it's interesting to build our image and to be concerned about how others perceive us. We use the arts. Arts are a lot more civil in communicating than politics. Would you not agree? So with that, I am going to close, because I really think it is going to be far more productive if we do a bit of Q&A. And then at the end, I'll tell you my final thoughts. May I open it? Thank you, though, for being so attentive. Oh, yes.
Linda, you know I always have a question. Thank you again for coming tonight. About 2 years ago, I was visiting my father in Arizona, and John Pizzarelli was doing a concert. He's a jazz guitarist from Connecticut. And we were especially delighted that not only was his quartet performing, but so was the Tucson Symphony.
Ah.
The concert was 2 or 3 weeks after the inauguration of Donald Trump. The music was fabulous. And then in the middle of the show, everybody put their instruments down. The spotlight went on to John Pizzarelli. He only had his guitar, and he sang "You Have to Be Taught." It was brilliant. It was brilliant. And that is exactly what you're saying. Use the arts. And it gave me goosebumps, not only because South Pacific's my favorite story and movie, but he really was elegant. It was beautiful music. He was making a statement, but it was a performance. And the other thing is, I also believe in the millennials. These kids are concerned. The kids in Parkland, Florida, bravo, talking about the vote. Nobody thought of that but them. They're fantastic, these kids. They are well informed because they're on their phones, because the technology is so familiar to them. And I have great hope in them as well.
Well, I think that I said this, this is terrible, but I did at a very senior facility. There were no young people about 3 weeks ago in Orlando. Remember, I live in a place I used to call it God's waiting room, and here I'm living there now myself. There's 85 people in the room. Everyone there is 96 and up. And I said something about the millennials, and 4 or 5 women who had grandchildren said, "You're absolutely right, my grandchildren," and they went on and on. And I was talking about a different time. I was not talking about civility. I was just talking about what ambassadors do, what diplomacy is all about. And I was pleased that they were so happy. They couldn't wait to tell their grandchildren, because the news media would really give them a very, very bad mark. You can't put all young men and women in one basket. In many ways, they're more civil than I am. I think, you were about to ask a question, I think. She's going to give you the mic. My kissing cousin.
Hi, ma'am. Thank you for being here. As I was listening to you talk about your experiences in Greece and Turkey, trying to walk the boundaries of our international contrasts, I couldn't help but think of my time in Germany, where I spent 4 years in a tank division, and in the Middle East during the Gulf War, where in both instances, I had these repeated touches of the kind that you talked about, with all of a sudden, I'm the American face to a bunch of Saudis. And their view of Americans is anything other than some 6'7" tank officer, right? Who's there to speak for a general. Right. I was an operations officer for a mechanized division, and I worked for a 2-star general. And the subtle, I guess my point is that, I had to learn real quick 2 languages beyond Spanish, which I was quite good at coming out of West Point. I learned German in a hurry because the Army said, "You're going to be our liaison to the German tank division that's on the other end of the continent over there." And all of a sudden I realized to get food, water, and whatnot to my tank crews, I had to learn, and did, certainly. And the Middle East was kind of another drop in the bucket with, hey, you're going to go talk to the Saudis and the Kuwaitis. My question is this. What else do you think we should be doing I'll start with K to 12, but I don't think it stops there, in education. We're hot on our rails now with STEM, which I think is fine. I'm an electrical engineer. I think we need more of that. We're starting to kind of realize STEM is now STEAM, and we drop the arts in, and I think that's a welcome add. I don't know that we've quite gotten our hands around this dealing with the rest of the world thing, and what kinds of tools do we need to be putting our kids in front of and some adults in front of to kind of get right with that? That's my question.
I know there's a children's section in this library. I've done work with Walt Disney Imagineering. I cried when I saw Tiana because I never thought I'd see a princess who looked like me. And And there were a number of women who did not look like me on one of these. We were going to do a launch of the Disney cruise, and I could not hold the tears back. And all of these women of my generation knew exactly what I was feeling, and they didn't look like me. They truly understood. But there are books now, and I've been in children's bookstores. Princess Rainier has done a book on It's a Sandwich. And one little child is taking peanut butter and jelly to class, and the other one has got pita bread and hummus. It's a magnificent story. Very, very touching. There are now scores of books written that bring two different cultures together. And the only reason why I saw it is because she had ever had some contact with Disney, and I said, I saw it in someone's office. I said, may I see this book? And they sent it to me. So I read it, and I hated to give it away, but I did. I gave it away to a child who really would have learned from it. We can begin it from K to 12 if our parents also are willing to open their minds to others. But did I just say to you a little while ago that there are a lot of folks that I was teaching who are blended? I don't have any family member, friends who are married to the same race, religion, or culture. I have Sierra Leonean friends married to a Turkish fellow. I go to a wedding of a Slovakian man to my black godchild. And I write a tribute to the parents, and I don't speak a word of Slovakian, but the woman at the credit unit at my university does. And so she translates it for me so that I can give it to the parents at the wedding. But it's called, that's being civil. I knew that it wasn't going to be fair to have these two elderly, they weren't that elderly, but parents of the groom, and I'm here talking about what it's like to get married later in life. I got married at 58 for the first time in my life, so I've almost been married 20 years. It's still working, and to a Trinidadian, which is another challenge. He would laugh too, but he would say, you know, how did I let myself do this? But children will be the first step at a very young age. There are enough exchange students from around the world. I just met 3 who are here on Fulbrights, who are working within the communities in the United States. They're architects, they're involved in theater, they're involved in law, and they make my heart sing. I spent about 20 minutes with them before I came down here tonight, because somebody at the Institute of International Education knew I might like to be with them, because I was an exchange student when I was in college, and I lived in southern France. And that family changed my life. I was accepted in Lyon and Bron in a way that I would never have been accepted in Boston, Massachusetts in 1959-60. I was in France in 62. So I would say to my colleague, the French ambassador in Senegal, I'm your colleague because of your country, because you helped me have a sense, your people helped me have a sense of self that I never had before. And that's what happens when people leave the confines of the United States. But we do need to be able to travel. Thank God there isn't a travel for us to go from here to there, much less try to have other folks come to the United States. So I think it involves the experience of exchange students being in classrooms in the United States at a very young age. We now have high school programs. The Gilman program does precisely that. And are you an exchange student? No. Oh, but you have a question.
I'm an immigrant.
Oh, but and guess what? So are we all.
True. Well, thank you for being here. And it's funny, what you're touching on is probably what I was going to ask. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to live as an expat in the Cayman Islands. While it's an English-speaking country, the challenge I faced was they had laid off all the locals, and they're bringing in an expat to close an audit point. And I came in facing people that were like, you laid off my colleagues, why are you here? And I found myself winning them through, I didn't have access to the arts, but food.
Wonderful.
Being from the islands myself, I was able to relate on all the different fruits and the different things.
Absolutely.
It was quite interesting to see, because the colleague that came with me came from the UK, and he was an Englishman. So he's like, what's that? What's that? What's this? And I'm like, knowing it, I was able to build some rapport. Yeah. I'm curious as if you had experiences like that as a young woman at a time when it might not have been as culturally acceptable to be a woman in those environments, especially like in Turkey?
The whole career.
Your whole career.
It was worse being a woman than being African American. Wearing this skirt was the biggest deterrent for me to have any kind of sense of acceptance. I say, and it's a good thing I looked at my notes, the diplomats are supposedly the epitome of civility, right? So in the late 80s, when I was back in Washington and I was the desk officer for Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, I'd walk into a room, I'd be the only person of color and the only woman to report on the political and economic situation in Greece, and Turkey, and Cyprus. All of my colleagues in the room were white males. They assumed that I was going to be the note taker. I was not going to give them any substantive information on what was happening with respect to Papandreou and his mistresses and the political situation in Greece. Never mind Turkey or Cyprus. The other thing that was very painful for me, growing up and being in the diplomatic service at that time, and every woman knows this, any color, was that when I left an official meeting, it was as if I disappeared. No one spoke to me. The same people didn't quite recognize me out in public. Now, I haven't changed, but when you're walking through the corridors of the Department of State, all of a sudden they start looking at the ceiling. Have you had that experience? Now, you have been in an official meeting. This is America. This is the hallowed halls of Foggy Bottom. And this is not in the Trump administration. I'm talking about 1985, 86, 87. I was disturbed. And don't run into somebody out in the street in front of the State Department because I don't know you. Because you're not needed and you don't matter anymore. There is that arrogance that we have, because let's be very honest. It is not easy to become a career diplomat. Many of my friends said I took the bar exam. I swear it was easier than the Foreign Service exam. The whole point of the exam is to make, it is really making certain that a certain level of society will be part and parcel of it. It is elitist. And so what have we done? We have programs now to destroy all of that. And I'm sure the founding fathers are turning over in their graves to make sure there are more women and minorities, first-generation college goers. And I'm very happy to say at the University of Central Florida, we now have 6 fellowship winners and who will become career diplomats. 2 are students of color, and 2 are women, and 2 are first-generation college goers. You cannot represent America if we can't have a foreign service that is effective if it doesn't look like America. The intelligence agencies are wise. How are you going to infiltrate a terrorist cell in Haiti and you've got blonde hair and blue eyes? Think about that. North Africa, you also have blonde hair and blue eyes, and you really want to infiltrate, you want to be embedded? It's not going to work. So the Department of State realized why the Defense Department, the CIA, and DIA were very effective in having a very diverse workforce, because they couldn't, how are you going to gather intelligence from somebody who doesn't look like you? There is always that fine line of those who are indigenous to the culture. If you are of Arabic descent, are you going to be loyal to the United States government if you have that ethnicity in your background? For many years, people who are indigenous to Greece were not allowed to go to Greece, because that's why I didn't get the first assignment as cultural attaché there, because finally a man of Greek descent was chosen. We had removed that barrier, because many times we thought that if you are of that ethnicity, you could become vulnerable as a potential double agent. And if you are Greek American or you're Italian American, you would be loyal to both your home country and to the United States, and back in the day of the Cold War. And so that made it really unfair to anyone of those ethnicities, because they couldn't be sent to countries where they already had the language. So think about what we do now. When I told you about the young man who scaled the wall in Paris. Just about 10 days ago on NPR, the interviewer asked a soldier, an American soldier, to talk about his time in Afghanistan and why he wanted to go back. He said, because I will never forget, I'm here to speak with you today because an Afghan interpreter saved my life. He said, I didn't even know his name. We had only been working together 3 days, and he saved my life. I actually said to him, why did you do that? The answer was, because you're a guest in our country. More civility than I think I could demonstrate. But it's not unusual for people of other nations to feel that way. My final comment, because we're almost at 7, is to say that every foreign national who works in an American embassy is far more loyal to the U.S. government than you could ever imagine. Weren't we at their behest, able to survive in a new culture because they were the brains, they were the institutional memory, and I'm sure in the military, for all that we had to do for the 2 or 3 years we were in that country. So we should never disrespect the people of those countries. So September 11th happens. These men and women came to work the next day. That's what I call loyalty. It's more than civility. I will say to you that I tell my students, being polite, being kind, being respectful is what we require in the diplomatic service. And I ask each and every one of my students to remember that they never touch someone so lightly that they do not leave a trace. Thank you. Do they even know I wrote a book? Oh, I guess they do.